Thomas Emacora, hello.
Hello.
You are a city futurist, regeneration architect, tech angel, cultural pioneer. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So you operate as a creative and strategic consultant for built environment clients of all kinds, municipalities, developers, communities, and corporations. What are the latest trends in architecture and communities design right now?
The most important aspect for me about trends is that they can be challenged. And obviously is, what you're seeing currently with sustainability and climate change and the need for us to be more aligned with the planet is a very big part of defining the landscape of the future of city making. And there's some hope in that. There's obviously issues with it, which is it could be disingenuous, ingenuous. We're doing a lot of greenwashing, and we're also creating a whole slew of new rules that will quickly make technology sort of be obsolete when we actually want to implement it. So it's not without, let's say, a certain hesitation I talk about trends in the built environment, because I find that we need to reshape them according to what's really needed. So I would say what to me is a defining trend is well-being, mental health, and connection to self and others. With COVID in particular and the pandemic, it's helped a lot of people see this as a critical notion. And we haven't actually designed cities very well or communities very well to cope with this. And this is something that was obviously inherent to indigenous communities that we've lost over time. And modernity has accelerated the breakup of community, the breakup of family, the breakup of spirit and mysticism and such. And so all these trends that we're seeing are the result, I think, of our need to connect. So just to simplify it, I would say, on the one hand, I'm very hopeful and want to aggressively work towards making the built environment live better with nature. So biomimicry and trending towards that sort of notion of learning from nature is essential. And on the other side is to connect more with people and how cities work for people, which has been a big focus of my work.
Talking about people, what a conscious community building and regeneration architecture should look like for you?
Conscious community building, to me, takes root in the notion of participation, co-ownership, and the sense of belonging that you can shape over time. What most cities are created out of today, especially if they're new cities or new neighborhoods, is a very top-down approach where you master plan, an owner, sometimes a city is involved, or a public-private partnership kind of starts to define what should be commissioned. Then architects of renown come in and they shape that landscape of design. And very late in the game, the community or the people who will live there or the dwellers actually get involved. So you sort of ask for permission at the end, and we focus a lot more on the capital, the servicing the capital that's going to be involved, making sure that we are following urbanistic regulation, etc. And then, later in the game, we talk about people. So I think that it's this notion of turning it on its head. And I wrote a book called The Recoded City, which focuses on participatory placemaking as a resource for us to reconnect, people with their place and develop a sense of ownership. So that to me is a very important part of conscious community making. I would add that obviously, having a connection to, spirituality and personal growth, is a different story. It's a different side of the spectrum. But I find that is also very, very critical. And so in regenerative design, even though we do focus on the notion of, being more aligned with nature, I think we have to integrate this notion of well-being and deepening the connections between people, so that cities actually represent the connections of people rather than the reasons why people paid for, being in a certain place to be in service of the machine to work.
So do you have some examples of this, of empowering citizens, and what are the concrete tools for that?
So there are examples all over the world that are now happening. And what I want to do is to go back to a personal example, which really sort of shaped my way of looking at it. Even though I talk mostly and work mostly with, let's say, design and technology, I actually have spent a large part of my professional career working with distressed communities. That's a very interesting place, let's say, to experiment with tools such as participatory tools, because people obviously have a lot of tension between each other, and it might be one of those places where you could have the highest amount of friction in the system for participation. And so we took on the job of reviving a walled garden outside of London, and it had been one of these historic places that was a beautiful mansion, and they were even proud of having the ability to grow pineapples in the late 19th century, which was sort of it was like the Ferrari of the time. Wow. Because you would have to grow it on a heap of manure, so you needed to have enough horses inside a greenhouse to be able to have the heat to be able to grow a pineapple. So when you put a pineapple on a table in Britain at that 150 years ago, it would be a sign that you were very wealthy.
Okay.
So it's just to say that the sort of environment is also about converting a place of heritage, but of elitist heritage, into a communitarian place. And so we set up these participatory design exercises where we brought the communities that were neighboring this walled garden to come in there and learn about nature, and then we would put them in different rooms and different groups and set them up to with a diverse group of people and ask them strategic questions that would then be filtered down to answers about their dreams and desires, for example, or their hopes and fears. And we would map that territory and put it back to them through publications that we would then share with the local village, but also the municipality and potential funders, etc. And so we did these studies. At the time it was a bit novel, well-being studies that were influenced by my experience in going to Bhutan and working on a documentary about gross national happiness. And effectively we were trying to understand what was the qualitative experience of people, so that we can prompt them to participate in the dreaming together. And once the dreaming together sort of really took on, it started to erase the differences in the community, and a community formed of interest, and that became the basis for us to actually present work and design together what would be the outcome. So I'm not particularly interested in the design aspect of that project in the walled garden, but is to give a concrete example of these different practices, and most of them are analog. We can do this digitally today, but I still am a big believer that first of all you need the connection with people. And you see, I would say almost 100% of professional design is very devoid of this connection to people. It's changing, so I'm exaggerating a lot now, and it has really changed in the last 10 years. When I wrote my book, it was sort of a new science. It's still a bit of a manual for this field. But I guess it's really moving quite fast now, and we understand that if we impose things on people, the ripple effects of that, and for example with social media, it's a bit like crisis management and reputation management. With communities now we have the same tools, and they can Instagram and they can use social media to say this is terrible, and then it adversely affects the sale of a project, for example. So urbanism and city making and architecture are being influenced by this digital sphere, but that only should manifest the connection to people in a real way.
We are more and more disconnected from nature, and as we're it's going to be 2/3 of the world population living in cities in the next future. How can architecture help us reconnect with nature?
So this is something I'm very excited about, obviously, and I'm going to just use two words: biomimicry and regeneration. And so there are many ways of defining regenerative design, but one of the key aspects obviously is that we're not going in a linear path. We're starting to learn, like nature, that we live and inscribe ourselves within life cycles, and that our materiality is governed by bigger rules than the ones that we have here, without going into anything spiritual or subatomic particles. there is something very, essential and beautiful to inscribe yourself within the cycles of nature. So regenerative design to me is an essential component to this. And, whether we look at the materials of the building that become upcycled. I was involved, for example, in a company called Up in Denmark. It's the first circular construction company in Europe. So we would, take timber frames and concrete foundations and bricks from old buildings, repurpose them and put them into new developments and actually improve the environmental quality, lower the cost, and of course, lower the waste and carbon footprint. So, we really know that we can do this. At scale is a complicated task, but it is no longer a technological challenge. So that's an example. Materials. Another example is obviously regarding energy generation and storage. So if people think about the problem of having too many electric cars and too many batteries, which obviously will become a negative externality of electrification for cities. We can already start to think, well, on a local level, we could have gravity batteries that basically store the power in lifting a large load into the air. And that's the energy that then, can power, a generation machine. And so all these things, we have so many technologies that are coming online that are going to transform the way that we can reconnect with life cycles of nature, and localize generation, storage, waste management, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I won't go into living machines, that basically are large recyclers using nature. But I think that this is, for me, what's very fundamental about regenerative design is that it is much more interesting than just trying to super insulate buildings and, put solar panels on the roof. We're way past this.
Okay.
And then the other side, which is biomimicry. And so I'm involved in a project called Supernature.
So biomimicry is imitation of nature.
Absolutely. There's different kinds of biomimicry, but it takes the premise and the idea that, the 5 billion years of evolution of life, roughly, have given us quite a complex set of knowledges, and we can now tap into them because of computational intelligence, and we can, replicate or learn or change. So, there's biomorphic biomimicry, which is basically trying to replicate the way that the shapes and geometries of nature are operating, or, there's biomimicry just in terms of how nature functions. Like, for example, how do you store CO2, or how do you put it in the ground so we can replicate that? And then there's biomimicry that's more in terms of systems and the influence that you have on systems. So I think, what I just want to mention is this project I'm involved in called Supernature that a guy called Dror started. And we're trying to seek, that sounds, but that's probably the best way to say it, to move out of a Cartesian logic of urban planning where it's, a grid system that had been operating for efficiency into a cellular design approach where the relationship between the different cells of buildings both creates a membrane that's a bit different in terms of relationship between transport nodes and urban living and, how people live, but also how nature is contained. And actually the buildings become the matrix and substrate for, soil to take root. There's even a lot of technologies right now that are coming out that connect the concrete foundations, for example, with mycelium, that can make it anti-seismic. So I'm very excited, in short, by all these different things that are popping out. The biggest problem, and I know you're probably going to ask me, is like, what is stopping us? And it is really the fact that these technologies need to mature together, and we need to deal with lobbies that are making construction industries, for example, a bit like pharma industries, prone to try and put certain things into the built environment that are no longer viable. And a very simple example of this is concrete. Represents a very, very big footprint, and arguably anywhere between 15 and 20% of the world's carbon footprint has some connection to concrete. And we are not able at this moment to not build in concrete because of urbanistic and planning laws that obligate certain foundations. So if we could demonstrate, for example, that you can change the foundational technology and put this into planning code, this would totally change our relationship to concrete. But obviously some people don't want to see that happening.
There are some digital twins. We've talked about them. Is it like you mentioned human connection, and that's the most important thing. What do you think about digital twins and the fact that we can try stuff in the digital world that would maybe have that could help to solve things?
I'm tremendously excited by the opportunities of simulation, because one of the biggest issues with experimentation is the cost of failure. So, fail faster and you'll succeed.
Yeah.
And so this is, let's say if we can digitize rapid community prototyping in the built environment, not that everything I care about is, the built environment, but it does, affect our carbon footprint, affect our quality of life, affect, ability to express ourselves, etc. So, I think it's a valuable thing to deal with. The externalities of wrong city making is, depression, anxiety, loneliness, death, accidents, you name it. So I want to just restate that, my care about this topic is because I see it connected to the tissue of living and how societies operate. And so the built environment, is a costly environment to operate in, and doing the wrong thing, is more costly because it's hard infrastructure. And so anything that we can do to improve the fluidity and, I would say, liquefied design, and fluidified in its relationship to people. So empowering people to participate in design is one of the main tools that digital twins will be used for.
Yeah.
And this is already happening. One of the speakers I brought here, called Ralph Horat, is working on one of such tools to equip both professionals and community members to empower them to be within a metaverse to co-design. So there's that aspect of, creating an environment where you can experience, not just sell in VR. This is like, not saying it's useless. I'm just saying that's a very limited use.
Yeah.
So I'm really hoping that, on the one hand, you'll have non-professional placemakers participate in what I like to call recoding their lives in the built environment and their communities through these digital twin metaverse experiences. And on the other hand, to really have professionals be able to collaborate much faster, much more efficiently, much more cost effectively before they actually build something. So I'll just give one example about this. I'm involved in an organization that is setting up an oceans DAO, so a decentralized autonomous organization that is targeting to sort of create a layer of digital space that allows for communities to come together and say they want to protect a certain part of the ocean, or that they can build something on top of the ocean digitally. So that's the second layer, that would effectively be able to be used as a campaign tool to speak, for example, to a municipality. So let's say you're an endangered island in the Maldives. How do you create the context for you to rise to work on, saving that island? Right now, it has to go through the filter of the municipality, local government. Sometimes it's a national priority issue, so then it can be, trickled up. But overall, being able to design virtual places, I think is an essential component of developing the knowledge, the participation, and the possibility to do cost-effectively things that would otherwise not do.
Okay. What do you think about, so there is some, obviously some amazing consequences of technologies. What should be the place of technology in our smart cities, knowing that people are not always comfortable by owning their own data, sharing their own data?
So I was expecting that question.
I knew you would.
And are you familiar with the Toronto city that Google tried to do? You've heard of that?
Please
Sidewalks
share.
Lab?
Yeah.
So Sidewalks Lab was an organization that was set up by Google. They created sort of a hyper-digitized city concept with a timber frame architecture, so that it would be, almost carbon neutral, and people would share everything, and especially their data. And there was a little red book that some people assimilated to the communist red book, and so that red book had some issues with data privacy, and many people thought it was invasive, and the whole city got stopped. So it is both an example of the fact that trying to do the right thing has unintended consequences that we really need to think through. So, the sort of the design ethics around cyber related to built environment is something that we're still fresh on. So this is a very powerful example and reminder that we're not ready for all the things that we want to experiment with and need to think it through at a faster pace. By the way, that's where digital twins could be useful as well. The second thing is that obviously it is unfortunate that some of these projects that are very ambitious, are not necessarily built. I'm not defending Toronto projects in general, but I'm defending the fact that a bit like, for example, environmental movements, even though I'm an environmentalist, have stopped lots of great projects happening because, for example, you couldn't build a place and put a windmill because it would kill birds. So I'm not defending any party. I'm saying that we really need to think about the scale at which we want to prioritize our efforts. And I think that data privacy and data invasion is something that is going to be only addressed if we create projects faster and build in governance tools that allow us to correct them as they move. So right now we're sort of saying this is good, this is bad, and we decide. And so terrible things see the light of day and don't correct. And, great things that might have needed some small corrections don't see the light of day. So I'm hoping that we'll find more middle ground through, design ethics and data ethics that will allow us to experiment faster, because we honestly don't know how to do it right, and it won't be the same everywhere. And right now I don't have a great smart city example for you that I think, everyone should follow. Dubai is interesting, Singapore is interesting, Copenhagen is interesting. I can say that these names are places where there's a lot of experimentation that's worthwhile looking at. But we're still in the early stages. And I, in general, find smart cities rather dumb because they're not actually built upon collective intelligence principles. They're built about connecting devices.
Would you dream at night sometimes to build a city from scratch?
I think that's all I do. Well, I guess no, that's not true. I do have other dreams. But building cities from scratch, let me make sure I understand your question, first of all. Are you asking me if it's something I wish I could do?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, I think that my history of work has been impacted by the fact that I chose to not become, let's say, a pure architect, a pure technologist, but a hybrid. Let's say this role and title as a futurist is actually a way for me to address that. So instead of saying, I operate in design or technology or this or that, I'm trying to bring forward the future that we want to have. And so, of course, I dream to be able to, design things from scratch. And I have to some degree. I've been involved in new neighborhoods. I've been involved in, new cities and new resorts and so building from scratch is not something I've not been involved in. But I do think that I have a preference for two scenarios. The first one is we don't talk very much about the embedded energy of the built environment.
Yeah.
So when you create something new, it's not necessarily the most efficient way, even if it's zero carbon. We need to really calculate the embedded energy in what we do, and not only the natural capital energy related, but also the human capital energy, and expending ourselves into the imagination of something that might not be a great place. So I would say that the notion of building something from scratch is appealing to me if it has the opportunity to put together all the different parts of the thinking and be very dynamic. So I dislike the word master planning.
Yeah.
I'm a fierce, deliberately fighting against the notion of master planning dominating the landscape of urban planning. I'm interested in micro, rapid planning, where communities get more involved, and what I call recoding. And so if you create the right conditions, and for example, here in Turkey, in Kaplankaya, where we are now, even though this is a tourist development, you could call it, from the outside, it has an opportunity, and I know we'll probably discuss this, to be a lot more. And I know that Burak and his family, who have resided here now for a number of years, I think over 10 years, even if they bought the land 17 years ago, they have imprinted this place with so much more. And they're a beautiful family, and they're so generous in the way that they work, which is unusual. And so I definitely could imagine that here you have an opportunity to create the right conditions for from scratch community design that is not based on one ideology of an intentional community founder, or one, capital play, or one technological play, which are basically many of the pitfalls that we fall into. So this is, I dream of that being more true here and in many places in the world, where if we do design from scratch, we do it with the right intentionality, and we do dynamic planning, dynamic microplanning. On the other side, I mentioned the two things. So one is, from scratch, but my greatest hope is that we manage to experiment very, efficiently with these new communities, so that we can kind of heal and cure our cities. Because yes, we're going to double probably the built environment in the next 30 years, which is an insane number. But at the same time, I do hope that we will be really rethinking that and retrofit our cities. And in order to do that cost effectively, we still have a lot of work to do. And it's not just putting insulation panels, airtight windows and things like that, or, cutting our tap or putting LED light bulbs. All that stuff is good, but this is really not, it's the 1% of the problem.
Thank you, Thomas. What put you on the way, on this path of community designing?
Probably what has made this part of me blossom is a lack of belonging. So I'm Danish and Italian. I grew up in France. My parents were not married. Their families were far away. They both experienced trauma on either side. My mother lost her first husband after a car accident. She was in the hospital with him for weeks, and she had a 6-month-old boy who was my brother. So she had experienced trauma. My father lost his brother in a car accident with his wife, and he took care of their 2 kids. So these things, just marked their lives before I came into the world, and they had a lot of that. And so not only did they have a lot of that, but they lived in a country that they didn't know and didn't really belong to. They had both lived in Switzerland before that because they were working there, and they met in Paris in an office. And, in a way, I came into the world, feeling without attachment to, our families. And they were unrooted. And the only thing that they had was love between us. So this bubble that I, gratefully grew up in, and I was lucky to have mostly a beautiful childhood. This bubble kind of was the only way to sort of say, well, belonging, if you have it in there, is incredibly powerful and empowering. As soon as you step out of that, well, then everything gets very fragile very quickly. And, when I saw other people that were living in their communities and their families, etc., they really, thrived in a different way. They had more friends. They could, go and see their cousins and this and that. I couldn't do all that. So I got a bit stuck in this kind of trio as well. And with my parents. And again, I'm not rejecting, any of those things. We all have the benefits of our education. But I think this sense that I had to create the belonging as soon as the bubble burst is the thing that made it so that everything that I've done throughout my life is to be, trying to curate my own quality of life. And so I would invite people to have dinner. I loved to cook. I had restaurants. I brought slow food to France. So I had a whole parallel life trying to create belonging. My ex-partner was a musician. We would go around touring in the world. I used to play a lot of music myself. I really believe in food and music as ways to gather. That's why I got into curating events also. I had this place called the Lime Wharf in London, which was the largest independent cultural center in London for 5 years. And really, it was about bringing a community together and creating a sense of belonging. I created the first makerspace in the UK, that had an impact agenda called the Machines Room inside the Lime Wharf. It was the largest fab lab, fabrication laboratory, where you learn 3D printing and laser cutting, etc. And we taught, artists and older generation members of the community and people from the Bangladeshi community that were living there, and kids, how to play with all these new technologies so they could participate in the future. But all that was about belonging. Wow. And so that's really what my journey has been about. And I think that that's why participation is so central, why care is so central. So yes, we can talk about the environment and climate change and, solving the world's biggest problems. But if they don't start from that place of care and belonging, I don't think they're going to take root.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks for sharing, Thomas.
Thank you.
One last question before you go. The harvest of the day. If something easy or simple could be done and would make the world a better place, what would it be for you?
Can I say two things?
Yeah, of course. Freedom. Challenge the rules.
I have to think out of the box. No, that was not very much out of the box. But yes, the first thing is for me really, is to look inside, and remember to look inside, as much as humanly possible. And if this becomes almost a curricular obligation, and we don't see schools tell you look inside, they say look outside. And so I think that if we can reframe our education around that somehow, I think anything that we can do that reinforces that statement, because once you love yourself, you can love the world, and once you love the world, you can give, and once you give, the world, rewards you. So I think that that's, really so essential. Again, one of the reasons why I really enjoyed coming to Harvest and curating for this session, or this edition. The other one thing that people really could do, but I'm going to point a finger at, let's say, a category of person. And so I work right now a lot with ultra high net worth individuals. And in order to, let's say, create, I have a history in branding as well, and identity, a small company that does that. Mostly we pick the projects that we do related to impact. And so one of the things that we've really noticed, because I'm in all these impact networks, is that there is a major misalignment in most families that have come from wealth or have built wealth quickly, and this is true in most geographies, between what they invest in terms of impact, or let's call it, philanthropy, even though we need to define that word in many different ways, and so how they invest and who they are.
Yeah.
And so this mismatch, to me is a very, very big problem, and one of the lowest hanging fruits in the world right now, with the largest generational wealth transfer in this decade in history, and the largest existential risk we've ever faced to date, to me is the lowest hanging fruit that I am now concentrating more power on to transform, let's say, family leaders into planetary stewards.
Sorry, do you have a concrete example of this?
When you know a famous philanthropist, for example, you may consider someone like, Richard Branson or Bill Gates, etc. And, without debating the qualities of those humans, they have managed to tell the world through their entrepreneurial success and then their philanthropic success, that's how they, their values are imprinted into the philanthropic vehicles they've created. When you look at most families, that is not the case. They are dealing with legacy issues, and so they can't build their legacy meaningfully and align it to their personality. So a concrete example of this is I'm helping an organization I can't name to revisit their history and tell their story through a different lens, so that they can start to connect the dots with their children and make their children participate in the legacy. This is before they talk about their actual wealth transfer technique. And it's about identity. And once that identity is much clearer and it's a conversation about the identity, then the legacy can flow from there. And if we do this right, just consider this as a number, it's anywhere between 600 and 650 trillion dollars or euros almost, that will be moved from one generation to the next in this decade. So it's a large number, and it can almost match our capital needs for solving most planetary issues.
Wonderful. That was the longest harvest of the day. It was worth it. Thank you so much, Thomas. Thank you so much.